Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're going to be digging into some legal documents all about judicial review in UK law. So, you know how sometimes it feels like public bodies can kind of do whatever they want? Well, judicial review is all about holding them accountable and making sure they're following the rules.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful tool. You can think of it as a way to make sure that those in power don't overstep their bounds.
Okay, so I'm already thinking about all those times I've been frustrated with some government policy or decision. But it sounds like this isn't just about suing the government because you don't like something they did.
Exactly right. Judicial review is much more specific than that. It's about legality and fairness, making sure that public bodies, like government agencies or local councils, are acting within the limits of their power and following the correct procedures when they make decisions.
So a court can actually step in and say, like, hold on, government, you didn't follow the right steps here.
Precisely. That's where the concept of acting lawfully comes into play. Did they consider all the relevant information? Did they use their power for its intended purpose? Did they give people a fair chance to have their say?
So it's not just about the what, but the how W. The process matters just as much as the decision itself.
Absolutely, and that's a crucial point. Judicial review is about holding decision makers accountable to the law, not necessarily overturning their decisions entirely.
So if I'm understanding this right,
Mm-hmm.
I can't just run to court every time I disagree with a government policy.
You got it. Not just anyone can initiate judicial review. There's this thing called standing, which is sometimes called locus standi. It's a fancy legal term that means you have to prove you're directly affected by a decision, or that you represent a group that is...
But it's not like anyone can just waltz in and say, hey, I don't like what you're doing.
Yeah.
You have to have some skin in the game, so to speak.
Exactly. And there's an additional layer to this as well. Sometimes cases are brought forward because they raise issues that are super important to the public. Even if the person who brings the case isn't directly affected, it's a way of ensuring that those critical issues get addressed.
So let's say IDEO have a case and IDEO have standing. What sorts of things can actually be challenged through judicial review?
Well, it covers a pretty broad scope. We're talking about decisions that are made by all sorts of public bodies, everything from government ministers to local councils, even institutions like the NHS and all kinds of regulatory bodies.
So it's not just about huge national policies then. This really does touch everyday life in ways I hadn't even considered.
Exactly. It could be something as local as planning permission for a new building in your neighborhood, or decisions that affect your healthcare or education.
Okay, so things are starting to get interesting here. Let's say a case actually makes it to court. What can the court actually do to fix things? Like what's in their legal toolbox?
The courts have several options available. These are usually called remedies. One of the most common ones is a quashing order, which essentially invalidates the original decision. It's like hitting the undo button.
No, so they can basically force a public body to go back to square one?
Exactly. They can also prohibit a public body from taking a certain action in the future, or issue what's called a mandatory order, which requires a public body to take a specific step.
So it's like they've got this whole arsenal of legal tools they can use to make things right. But I'm guessing there have to be some pretty specific reasons why a decision might be considered unlawful in the first place. It can't just be because somebody didn't get the outcome they wanted right.
You're exactly right. There are specific grounds for judicial review. Think of them like legal red flags that signal a decision might have been made unlawfully.
Okay, lay it on me. What are some of these legal red flags we should be looking out for?
One ground is illegality. Basically, this means a public body has gone beyond its lawful powers.
So like if a local council tries to make a rule that actually goes against national law, I can see how that'd be a problem.
Exactly. Another ground is irrationality. This applies when a decision is so unreasonable that no reasonable person could have made it.
Irrationality. So it's not just about disagreeing with the decision. It has to be something truly out there, like something totally illogical.
Right. The courts have set a pretty high bar for what actually constitutes irrationality. It's not enough for a decision to be unpopular or even unwise. It has to be something that you could show is just demonstrably absurd.
Okay, yeah, I see how that could be a tricky thing to prove. So what other red flags should we be on the lookout for?
Another big one is procedural impropriety. This one's all about making sure things are fair and transparent in the decision-making process. So, like, did the person making the decision have some kind of bias? Did they not give someone a fair hearing? Did they withhold important information? Those are the sorts of things that would fall under this category.
So even if the decision itself seems okay on the surface, the way they got there could still be a problem?
Exactly.
That makes sense. But what about situations where there's no clear-cut rule that's been broken, but something still feels off? Like you get this sense of unfairness or like a broken promise.
That's where the concept of legitimate expectation comes in. It's a little more complex. But basically, it means that if a public body has been acting in a certain way, or if they've made promises about how they'll do things, people have a right to expect that they'll continue to act that way.
So it's about maintaining trust and making sure things are predictable.
Exactly. If a public body suddenly switches things up without a good reason, it can be seen as unfair and potentially even unlawful.
Wow, this is fascinating stuff. It's like we're getting this behind-the-scenes look at how the legal system actually works to protect people, to keep them safe from those in power doing whatever they want.
And we're just scratching the surface. To really get a handle on judicial review, we need to look at some real-life cases. That's where the real drama unfolds, and where all these principles we've been talking about really come to life.
Okay, I'm hooked. Let's jump into those cases then and see how this all plays out in the real world.
Okay, so are you ready for some real-life legal drama?
Always. Hit me with it.
All right, so let's go back in time for a minute. Back to the 1940s, there was this case called Wensbury Corporation. A local council tried to ban kids from going to the cinema on Sundays unless they were with a grown-up.
Oh, wow. Talk about a Sunday bummer. What happened? Did the kids revolt?
Pretty much. Well, not quite. But the courts definitely stepped in. They basically said, hold on a sec, that's not reasonable. And this case ended up establishing a super important principle in judicial review. It's called Wensbury unreasonableness.
Wensbury unreasonableness. That sounds intense.
It is. It basically means that the decision was so out there, so illogical, that no reasonable person could have possibly made it. And this set a really high bar for overturning decisions based on irrationality.
So thanks to that case, Sunday matinees were saved for future generations. Any other cases that really show how impactful judicial review can be?
Oh yeah, tons. There was this one case involving a mink farmer who was pretty upset about the government's decision to ban fur farming.
Oh, yeah, I vaguely remember that one. What was the issue
So the
there?
government came up with this compensation scheme for the farmers. But get this, it only covered female mink, not the males.
Wait, seriously. How are they supposed to breed mink without male mink?
Exactly. And the court saw that too. They ruled that leaving out male mink from the compensation scheme was totally irrational and unfair. It's a great example of how judicial review can make sure that even when the government's trying to do something big, they still have to pay attention to the details and make sure things are fair.
It's like saying, hey, you can't just fix part of the problem and ignore the rest. You got to look at the whole picture.
Exactly. And speaking of the big picture, how could we forget about some of those massive, high-profile cases that have shaped UK law? I mean, remember Brexit?
How could I forget? It felt like the whole country was on edge, just waiting to see what would happen next.
Well, guess what? Judicial review was a major player in that whole drama. Remember when the Supreme Court had to decide whether the government could trigger Article 50, the thing that officially started the process of leaving the EU? The question was, could they do it without an act of parliament?
Yeah, that was a big deal. And what did they decide?
The Supreme Court ruled that the government couldn't just sidestep Parliament on a decision that huge.
Yeah.
It was a massive check on their power and a huge reminder that even when things are crazy and unprecedented, the rule of law still matters.
So judicial review really is involved in everything, from local stuff to massive constitutional crises.
Absolutely. And honestly, we've only just scratched the surface. There are so many more cases out there that show how this works in real life.
Okay, I'm totally on board with this. Give me another example, though. Something that shows how this impacts people's actual lives.
Okay, so how about this one? In 2020, right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was this case called R on the application of Article 39, v. Secretary of State for Education. It was all about the government making changes to childcare regulations right when things were super chaotic.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
It was a tough time for everyone, especially parents trying to figure out childcare with schools closed and everything.
Totally. And the court actually found that the government hadn't properly consulted with the Children's Commissioner before making these changes. They said it was irrational to leave out such a crucial voice in the decision-making process.
So even in a crisis, the government can't just go making big changes without thinking about how it affects people, especially the most vulnerable.
Exactly. That case is a perfect example of how judicial review helps to ensure that the government follows proper procedures and that everyone's rights are taken into consideration, even during extraordinary circumstances.
That one really hits home. It shows how all these legal principles we've been talking about aren't just some abstract ideas. They have real consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely. And sometimes those consequences are about making things happen, not just stopping them.
You mean like when a public body isn't doing something they're supposed to be doing?
Yeah. Remember, judicial review is all about making sure that public bodies are actually fulfilling their legal obligations. So let's say there's this dangerous situation in a local community. Maybe there's a bridge that's about to fall apart or some kind of ongoing health hazard. If the local council is just ignoring it, a resident could potentially use judicial review to force them to take action.
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought about it like that. It's not just about stopping the government from messing up. It's also about making them do the right thing.
Exactly. And that's another reason why understanding judicial review is so important. It gives individuals and communities a way to hold those in power accountable and to make sure they're actually serving the public good.
Speaking of holding power accountable, you mentioned earlier that the government was actually thinking about putting some limits on judicial review. What's the deal with that?
Yeah, so back in 2020, there were all these reports that the government was looking for ways to make it harder to challenge their decisions through judicial review. This was all happening after a big Court of Appeal ruling where they stopped the deportation of a group of people to Jamaica because they hadn't been given proper access to lawyers.
So it sounds like there's this push and pull going on. The government wants to be able to do what they need to do. But there's also this concern about making sure people's rights are protected and that the government is held accountable.
It's a delicate balance for sure.
This whole conversation has really highlighted that tension for me. On one hand, we want the government to be able to get things done efficiently. But on the other hand, we want to know that they're acting fairly and not abusing their power.
And that's where judicial review comes in. It helps to manage that tension and to make sure that power is being used responsibly.
Okay, one last thing that's been bugging me.
Yeah.
We talked about challenging decisions and making the government take action. But where does judicial review stop? Like, what are its limits?
That's a really important question. One major limit is that judicial review is mainly focused on decisions made by public bodies, not private ones. So you can't use it to challenge a decision made by your employer or a private company or to settle a dispute with your neighbor.
So it's specifically about keeping the government in check.
Exactly. It's about making sure that anyone who's acting on behalf of the state is doing so within the boundaries of the law.
That makes sense. But even within the government, are there any areas where judicial review just doesn't apply?
There are definitely some areas where courts are traditionally a bit more hesitant to step in, things like national security or really complex policy decisions that require very specific expertise. The idea is that judges shouldn't be trying to second-guess decisions that need a very particular kind of knowledge or that involve sensitive information that the courts might not have full access to.
So it's about recognizing that there are different branches of government and that each one has its own area of expertise. The courts aren't meant to be micromanaging every single thing the government does.
That's right. Judicial review is a powerful tool, but it's not supposed to be a blank check for the courts to just override any decision they don't like. It's all about finding that balance between protecting individual rights and making sure the government can actually function effectively.
It all comes back to checks and balances, doesn't it? Making sure that power is spread out and that no one person or group has too much control.
Exactly. And judicial review is a key part of making that system work.
Wow, my head is spinning after all that. It's amazing to see how all these complex legal ideas actually play out in the real world and how they can have such a big impact on people's lives.
And remember, this is just a tiny glimpse into the world of judicial review. It's a constantly changing area of law with new cases and interpretations popping up all the time.
So it's not just about learning the rules. It's about understanding how those rules are being used and debated in the here and now. That makes it even more interesting.
Totally. And it reminds us that the law isn't just some fixed set of rules. It's something that's always changing and evolving along with society and all the challenges we face.
Well, I know I'm definitely feeling inspired to learn more about all of this. It's empowering to understand the tools that are out there, to hold those in power accountable, and to make sure things are fair and just.
I agree. And who knows, maybe one day you'll even find yourself using judicial review to fight for a cause you believe in.
You never know. This whole deep dive has definitely opened my eyes to the possibilities. But before we get too carried away with all our newfound legal knowledge, I think it's time to wrap things up for today.
I'm with you. It's been an awesome journey through the world of judicial review.
And all our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive has made you curious about how the legal system works and how it shapes the world around us.
We hope you'll keep digging into this topic and share your thoughts and questions with us.
We'd love to hear what stood out to you and what questions you still have after all this.
Yeah, come join the conversation on our social media. Let's keep this discussion going.
Until next time, happy diving. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here, learning about how individuals and groups can use judicial review to challenge decisions and hold the government accountable. But I'm curious about the flip side of that. Where does judicial review stop? What are its limits?
That's a super important question to consider. One of the biggest limitations is that judicial review is really meant to deal with decisions made by public bodies, not private companies or individuals. So you wouldn't use it to challenge a decision made by, let's say, your internet provider, or to try and resolve a dispute with a neighbor. It's really about government accountability.
Ah, okay, so it's specifically about making sure the government is acting within the law.
Exactly. It's about making sure that anyone who's using government power, whether it's a minister, a local council, or any other public body, is doing so fairly and legally.
That makes sense. But are there any areas, even within the government, where judicial review just doesn't apply? Like, are there any topics that are completely off limits?
There are certain areas where courts have historically been a bit more cautious about getting involved, things like national security or very technical policy areas where judges might not have the specialized expertise to make a judgment. The idea is that courts shouldn't be second-guessing decisions that require deep knowledge in a particular field or that involve sensitive information that might not be appropriate for a public court setting.
So it's about respecting the boundaries between different parts of the government. The courts aren't meant to be looking over the shoulder of every government department and micromanaging everything they do.
Right. Judicial review is powerful, but it's not designed to give judges free rein to overturn any decision they happen to disagree with. It's about finding that balance between protecting individual rights and making sure the government can actually do its job effectively.
It all goes back to checks and balances, right?
Mhm.
Making sure power is distributed and that no one entity has too much control.
Exactly. And judicial review plays a crucial role in making sure that system of checks and balances actually works.
This whole deep dive has given me a whole new understanding of how the legal system works to protect people's rights and hold those in power accountable.
It's a complex system, but it's all ultimately designed to ensure fairness and accountability. And that's what really matters.
This conversation has been so insightful. Thanks for walking us through all the ins and outs of judicial review.
My pleasure. It's always fascinating to explore these complex legal concepts and to think about how they shape our lives.
And to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has sparked your own interest in the power of judicial review and how it works to uphold the rule of law.
We encourage you to keep learning and keep asking questions. And as always, happy diving.
Until next time.